G'day, curious minds, and welcome back to Onion Unlimited, the podcast where we are going to peel back the layers of life and explore some of the big questions. I'm joined this morning by my friend Nick from New York, I believe you are, aren't you?
That's just what it says on Twitter.
Oh, is it? Is the Warwick bit a little bit of a joke?
Yeah, a little tongue in cheek
Little
there.
tongue in cheek, back to the old XJW days. So Nick used to be a Jehovah's Witness, just like me. You're not now, and I was just reading your bio, actually, Nick, on Twitter. It says that you're an atheist researching religion, philosopher, enjoyer, bringing philosophy to those who have been affected by religious trauma. XJW. How's that going with the bringing the philosophy to people that are affected by religious trauma? Are they interested? Are they up for the philosophy, or is that a bit of a tricky one?
I think we share some similar experiences with that. You'd be surprised. I feel like it's not something that people who have suffered religious trauma try to jump back into. I think a lot of the time they try to deprogram and in a lot of ways try to heal their trauma first, and then maybe then they have time.
Yeah, maybe when they're in a bit of a better space, they might be able to look at the philosophy. What do you reckon the benefits are of? What do you think the benefits are of going down the philosophical route? How does that help you if you've sort of had a life in a cult, programmed the way that you're supposed to think?
I think primarily it helps with the, how would I say it? The critical thinking. I think you can go hypercritical. Just skepticism, and that skepticism, if unchecked, can be unhealthy in a different number of areas in your life, including the one that is responsible for kind of restructuring or reformulating a narrative. Because I think that's something that comes natural to human beings, to kind of situate or create a narrative or worldview. And if you don't have the resources to create I wouldn't even want to say coherent, but just if you don't have the resources to even kind of map out what a worldview would look like, that can lead you to all sorts of different areas.
Yeah, I get that. It's so particularly when you're in a cult, I would say the same applies to some degree to any kind of religion, but particularly a cult. Your thinking is done for you, isn't it? Particularly if you've been born into the cult, you've always been kind of, spoon-fed the answers to everything, and actually discouraged from any kind of philosophical kind of, thinking on your own. There's actually a Bible verse, isn't there, where it talks about the traditions and philosophies and empty traditions of men. That philosophy is kind of it's a bit of a bad word, isn't it, within the cult environment?
Yeah. Well, one, because of that critical thinking aspect of it, but I think it's also that it harkers back to that idea of there might be physical towers of Babel, and the edifice in terms of when it comes to thought, it's philosophy. That philosophy is like a tower of Babel, and when it comes to knowledge.
Yeah, not thought of as godly in any way. I do think the two can coexist side by side, though. I think you can be. You may not be able to be religious and particularly very philosophical. I'm not sure whether those two things go together, although there are some philosophies that are kind of religious, aren't there? Confucianism and Buddhism, and even Advaita Vedanta is a philosophy, but I would say it's more of a philosophy than a religion, actually. So I'm not sure whether structured religion and philosophy can coexist, but I do think spirituality and philosophy can coexist.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think there's a lot of overlap in that area. And then I guess with like definitions of philosophy, right? You can start getting into what constitutes philosophy and what is the purpose of philosophy. That would kind of give you an answer to that.
Let's start there, because so I've entitled this episode "A Beginner's Guide to Philosophy," and there's method in my madness here. So I I don't think I'm completely thick. I think I've got a reasonably smart brain on my head, but sometimes I stand in awe, kind of at the sidelines when I listen to sort of guys like yourself and read your tweets. And there's another fella actually, a chap called Chris, that I spend quite a bit of time with. He's the same. He's got like, first of all, you both seem to have like a very deep background in the subjects that you're interested in. So not just philosophy in general, but you seem to understand the different philosophers and the different philosophies that they had, and you understand that well. Same with Chris. He's very much like that. And both of you also have quite a vocabulary on you. So you're able to sort of dip into your subject, and you're sort of firing off these words and what have you. And sometimes I'm like, okay, if I understood the words, I'd understand the philosophy. Does that make sense? I suppose that's the same with everything. I was thinking about this last night. Like my background is web development, and also I've also been in the medical industry in the past. And if I was sort of using medical terms or web development terms, it might be that someone who's not got that background just doesn't know what you're talking about. Yeah, does that make sense? So I think that first kind of hurdle with me when it comes to philosophy is I need to understand some of these terminologies. So I'm going to try and get you to teach me a bit this morning, if that's okay. Shall we start with philosophy itself? So how do you define philosophy? What is philosophy? What does the word mean?
I've been thinking about this for a really long time, because when I actually took the time to kind of reflect on that question, I was like, man, do I even have like a definition? Because I could give you like a textbook definition of philosophy, which is something like we look at the etymology of the word, which would be philia or philos, which is love. And philia is a specific type of love. It's like a brotherly love. So it's like a friendship. So it's a friendship of wisdom. Because Sophia is the other word in that in philosophy, which is wisdom. So it's friendship with wisdom, or lover of wisdom. And it was posited as a definition against what one calls a sophist. So a sophist is someone who was very rhetorically sharp, someone who knew how to argue, but they did it for money. They did it for either lucrative reasons, so to feed themselves, to have high status. At that time, when we usually think back of philosophy, we think of ancient Greece, and we think of individuals, who were like sitting around and like the academia or whatever, and debating things like that. So that was to some degree true, but there was a group called the sophists, who were people who you could kind of think of it like today's modern grifters, like online.
Right. Yep.
And they just give me a couple bucks and I can teach you how to sound smart.
Right.
And so the philosopher is someone who actually wanted to be like, okay, well, I want to know truth. I want to be acquainted with wisdom.
So the sophists were just into wisdom for money, self-gain, whereas the philosophists loved wisdom. They did it for the love of it. I've got it. Right, okay. So, I mean, when I think of philosophy, I think about a kind of search for truth and understanding, meaning. That's what I tend to think of with philosophy. But I tend to think of it more from a point of view of using your brain to come up with the answers, rather than perhaps carrying out scientific experiments. So it's more kind of thought experiments. Is that fair to say?
This gets into like the distinctions, right? Could you have, we usually, at least in the modern world, we think, for example, science, religion, and philosophy as distinct ways to kind of cut the world and then make sense of that to find truth. And to some degree, I would agree with that sentiment. Science is dealing with the empirical, with the testable. Religion seems to deal with the appetitive aspect of the soul, which would be like ritual, religion, faith. And then philosophy seems to be like somewhere in the middle between those two. So it's kind of the it in certain aspects it deals with questions of faith, but it uses tools or conceptual tools that science has. So like logic, reasoning, things like that.
Yeah, because I suppose science, we do think of science as being testable, but then I suppose you've got like theoretical physicists. And I was watching the Oppenheimer film the other evening, fascinating. And like he basically never laid hands on a test tube or a Bunsen burner. It was all just stuff he was thinking of in his head, and then other people tested it. So yeah, I do tend to think, the philosophy. I would say I am a bit of a philosopher, certainly not trained and certainly not sort of well educated in it, but I would say a lot of my kind of life is philosophical in that a lot of it just happens up here. I'm not really sort of one to use my hands to test things. I tend to kind of do all the
thinking, the thought experiment,
the thinking up there. Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, even kind of in other areas, like when I was a kid, I would desperately wanted a Rubik's cube because all the kids at school had a Rubik's cube, and I actually figured out how to do the Rubik's cube in my head because I didn't have a Rubik's cube. That's how poor we were. And then eventually, because I could convince my mum and dad that I could do the Rubik's cube in my head, they went out and got one. So we've learnt a little bit about philosophy from the start. So it means to love wisdom, and it's about this kind of thinking through things through in your head. Now, I have been thinking about the main branches of philosophy, and I made a couple of notes here. If you think of philosophy, the whole philosophy is like a tree. I actually made a list the other day on my website in a blog of some 250 different philosophies, which just blew my mind. But I've managed to narrow it down to 5 main branches of this kind of philosophy tree. Tell me if I've got this right. So we've got epistemology, metaphysics, logic, axiology, which includes aesthetics and ethics, and then political philosophy. Is that a reasonable? Would you make any changes to that?
I would make some changes.
Okay, let's do that.
I would fuse some and kind of bring in some others, but that's a pretty comprehensive.
Okay, can you tell me what changes they are? Because I'm going to make some notes here. So, would you keep epistemology?
I would keep epistemology.
Okay.
I think you mentioned metaphysics.
Metaphysics, yeah, second one. Next one was logic.
Logic. I would fuse that one with epistemology. Logic is something that we use within epistemology.
Epistemology and logic. Okay. Next one was axiology, which includes aesthetics and ethics.
Axiology is good. That's a very technical term. I would colloquialize it and split that into its own category of ethics and its own category of maybe not its own category of aesthetics, but aesthetics is kind of like a like if you have like free time, you can then enjoy your aesthetics cake.
Okay. So to speak. And political, would you include that or would you drop that one?
That would be that one's another one, kind of like aesthetics. It's you derive your politics in my view from your ethics. Once you have an ethical system, then you can start.
Okay, we'll fuse that with ethics. So if we say then we've got epistemology - logic, metaphysics, axiology, aesthetics, and then ethics - political views.
Yes. I would also add, I guess metaphysics covers it, because sometimes we like to make a distinction in metaphysics with ontology. which is the study of being itself. But that's just metaphysics. It's just a branch in metaphysics.
Okay, right. So let's work through these one by one, and if you can sort of help me understand what each of these means. So epistemology dash logic. What epistemology? What does that mean?
Epistemology comes from it has the root word episteme, which is knowledge, and so ology, the study of knowledge. It's a formalized study of knowledge, and that, in a way, already kind of introduces notions of logic or reasoning, because to some, those rules of logic are ingrained in how we even acquire knowledge.
Okay, so epistemology, would that involve the way that you think?
To some degree, yes. It would be how one might possibly think. And in terms of that content, in terms of the content of your thinking, how it is that you come to know things.
Okay.
So how can you say, I know that?
Oh, right. Okay. How? Right. Okay. So that's where the logic bit comes in. So epistemology would be, if I state a belief, I say, I believe this, or I know this. The philosophy of epistemology would then kind of demand that I give my reasons for that and how I got to that point.
Yeah, you can then start giving you can do either rhetoric, which is just kind of like talking, kind of like how we are, and then the formalized way to argue, which would be arguments. So you can give a syllogism. That would be a formal argument.
Right. Okay. I think I get that. So epistemology is kind of your method. Yeah.
Just your method. I'm kind of like wanting to say yes to methodology, because there is a formality to methodology, right? How you teach someone. But epistemology, yes, it would be how one acquires knowledge. So
how one acquires it.
I can give you like two brief examples.
Yeah, give us a couple of examples. So how do we illustrate epistemology?
So we can think about it in terms of schools of epistemology. And I'm just going to give like the main ones, kind of like if you were to go to school and take a class, they would kind of start with these schools, which would be the empiricists, who are like the way that you perceive things, the way that they interact with your senses. That's
when you talk about empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge, you can actually see it. It's there in front of your eyes. Okay, yeah, empiricists, yeah.
So there has to be something that, in this case, yourself, that does the perceiving, and those perceptions then get integrated. So you can use your five senses, you can use the external world. Any way that you obtain information has to come from external sources.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then there's rationalism.
Right. I've heard of rationalism. I don't know what that means. What does rationalism mean?
Rationalism is the way that we obtain knowledge is through these intuitions. So kind of like you can think about it like a framework. So our mind is already a concrete framework. And so, for example, we don't need to experience one to know that 1 + 1 = 2. That's what the formal term of that is, a priori knowledge, which is knowledge that you don't need experience for.
I just know. I just know.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. What do you call that? A priori. A priori. So let me just piece this together. So epistemology is kind of how you arrive at your conclusions. It's the method. It's a study of how you actually obtain your knowledge, why you know what you know, and then you've got two examples of that there. I could point at something and say, well, I know that's true because I can see it, it's there, or I can taste it or hear it, or and then I can say to the other person, can you see it as well? And they'd say, yeah, I can see it. So I'm not like delusional. It is actually happening. That's empiricism.
Yes.
The other side would be rationalism, where I say I know. For example, I know that when I die, I'm going to return to spirit and ultimately be assimilated back into a singularity of source. I can't prove that. I can't point at anything. But to me personally, that feels like I know that it's an intuition.
Well, I want to make a distinction
would that
between
work, or would that be pushing it a bit?
that would be pushing it just a little bit.
Would
I
it?
can
All
see
right. Okay.
where you can make that argument using rationalism,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
for example,
Rationalism.
you
Yeah.
can use reason and that
Well,
framework
some
to
people would say it was irrational.
um, you'd be surprised. A lot of rationalists historically have been um, theists.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know theism nowadays gets a lot of bad rep for being irrational, especially for evangelicals. But historically, rationalism has been predominantly theistic.
Yep.
Um, so you could get at that point where you could say something like, well, there's an irreducible aspect of myself, which is something like my soul. And that
Mm-hmm.
soul would have to return to the uncaused cause, which would be like something like God, or something like the unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. So using those basic principles, like really fundamental, very bare principles, like 1 + 1 = 2, you can then develop a system that gets you to all those complex steps, where you could say something like, I know that I am a soul which will return to the great
Right.
one.
So I'd have to be so. Rationalism is more than just saying I know because I know. It calls on you to provide a few more steps with the logic side of things.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you could say you're just being irrational. Is that fair?
that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it begs the rationalist to start with irrefutable or ineffable axioms
Hmm.
or rules. So something like the law of identity or the law of non-contradiction. So something can't be itself and not itself at the same time. So that's a reasonable um, a priori rule. You just know it because it's intuited. You don't need to experience contradiction for you to
Could
know
I
that that's
use
contradiction.
things, for example, like if I was trying to say, I know that when I die I continue on. Could I use, for example, things like near death experiences?
Mm,
Because
well, that would
I've
be
got a
then
guy coming on the show in a week or two, who runs a near death experience community, and he's coming on to talk all about near death experiences, and I kind of want to get him telling me some of his experiences. And obviously I don't know for sure that these things happened, but he's going to be telling me, no doubt with great conviction, that they did.
yeah. Um, that's a tricky one because it's how do we that's testimony, and the way
Hmm.
that we put how much weight do we put into our testimony kind of begs what epistemological system we're using. So an empiricist might say, well, it's an empirical case, or isn't it's a source of empirical proof that this person had a life or death experience.
Because they experienced it
And
with their senses.
yeah, and I can't refute that. If somebody told me, well, my experience was that I had a near death experience, you can't really refute that. The only way that you could start taking that in is how much value you put into testimony. Like you can
Hmm.
only take that their testimony and then weigh that against other evidence. So
Right.
that's it gets tricky because then we get into
Can you give me an example then? Can you give me a good example of rationalism?
um,
Something that you might just know, and you can say, well, that's because I'm a rationalist.
yeah, I'll just give the most famous rationalist, which would be someone like Descartes. I think, therefore I am. So that's kind of an irrefutable. Um, I mean, there are arguments, and we can get into that later if you'd like, but that's kind of irrefutable because, for example, even if all of your senses are being um, altered by the Matrix or the evil
Yeah,
demon,
some sort of
whatever.
simulation or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, let's say you're the brain in the vat. You brought up that example earlier. You still can't deny that there's something which is you, whatever you is, that is doing the thinking. So something has to exist for there to be
There's still a
thinking.
something that's thinking. Yeah.
Mhm. So
Okay.
that
Yeah,
would be
that's
like
good.
a
Yeah.
base level axiom.
That would be intuitive a priori. Okay, that's awesome. Right, I think I've got that. So, epistemology logic includes empiricism and rationalism. Excellent. Right, let's move on to the next one. Metaphysics. Now, this is probably a little bit more my kind of area. We're talking here about the nature of reality, so things like space, time, consciousness, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's it's funny. The name metaphysics comes from the ordering of Aristotle's books. So he had a book on biology, a book on physics. He had like 5 books. It's like the ethics, yada yada yada, and then
Okay.
the last book is titled Metaphysics, and meta just means after or above, and it
Oh.
was the book that came right after physics.
The book that came after the physics book. And that was Aristotle. What sort of things did that book include?
All sorts of arguments. It doesn't follow from the other books. It's just things that could not be cataloged in, for example,
So is
like a
this like
physics book.
weird shit, like sort of divination and crystal balls and spirits and?
Yeah, it was. I mean, metaphysics does have a background in like the formalized study of, for example, within metaphysics we have ontology, which is the formal study of being. So what does it mean to be an object? What does it mean for something to be or to exist? That
Okay.
would be ontology.
Ontology is all about being.
Mm-hmm. And
Okay.
so metaphysics is kind of like the branch of philosophy that deals with the questions, or like the items that you brought up, which would be like space. What is the nature of space? What is the nature of time? What is the nature of divine essence? Things like that.
Oh,
Questions
so
that
it's
cannot be
about the
testable.
nature of the nature of God, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That would include that would be under metaphysics. Okay, so physics, I suppose, yeah, because I suppose physics in general does it have anything to do with physics, or is it literally after physics? Is it sort of aside from physics, or does
It
it have
works in
any?
tandem.
It
So,
works
for
in
example,
tandem.
you could have a philosophy of physics, which this is kind of my this is kind of my problem with contemporary particle physics, which is they make a lot of claims about what things are. For example, scientists will come out and they'll be like, yeah, there's these little things called atoms and
Yeah.
quarks and all of these tiny bits. And then you ask them, what does that really mean? And they'll tell you, well, oh, it's a collapse in the wave function of the Schrodinger equation, blah blah. And it's like, okay, I still don't know what that means. And so if they are making physical theories, those theories have to tell you something about what physical reality is. That's metaphysics. There's no moment they start telling you, well, this theory doesn't explain physics. It explains theoretical blah 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 blah. Well, that's a metaphysical claim. They're making a claim that reality, if it is physical, behaves in this certain way. That's a metaphysical claim.
Right. I think I get that. So when it comes to like quantum mechanics, quantum physics, that kind of thing, are they actually getting to the nature of things, or are they always just kind of creating more questions?
I would say they're creating more questions,
Yeah.
because it's not quite clear. We'd have different interpretations of quantum physics. We can, if we, for example, use the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, it says that something like consciousness has to be at the base level.
Yeah.
Consciousness makes physical reality, because if there's an observer that collapses the wave function in the Schrodinger equation, we either get the wave or we either get the particle.
Yes.
We don't get both.
Yes.
Now, if you get the Everett interpretation, that says no, all of the possible worlds, all of the possible outcomes exist. So we get multiverse.
Yep.
And that's scientists pretend, or I shouldn't say this. Scientists make claims about physical reality, but a lot of the times they sneak in their metaphysics. They say stuff like, "Oh yeah, it's many worlds, it's different dimensions, and all of this stuff." That's a metaphysical claim. You can't test that.
Right. Okay.
Your theoretical model might make more sense under that assumption.
But that's a metaphysical thing. Yes, I've got that. Yes. That's after physics. It's beyond physics. Yes, exactly. I've got it. So metaphysics is kind of outside the realms of physics, although physicists may call upon metaphysical things in order to sort of prop up their theories.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Brilliant. Okay, and ontology is all about being. Right, this next one, axiology. What on earth is axiology?
So axiology, in terms of Aristotle, who kind of popularized the term, and it's used a little bit different in like medieval philosophy. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the study of first principles. So in his view, he had a system of like realism, like empirical realism, that posited something like, well, we can observe reality, and reality is the way that it's observed. So, for example, if you look at a table, that table is physical.
Is that a cat moving in front of you?
That is my cat.
I've got all sorts of weird things happening here at the moment. I've got a cat going across, and for some reason, your camera keeps going really small and then big again. I keep moving it around the screen. I think it's at my end.
One quick second.
That's cool. No, it's great. It looks good on you. Nick's disappeared for a moment to go and deal with his Schrodinger's cat.
Okay, sorry about that.
Hey, he's back again. Oh, hang on. Now you've gone. Let me just resize you at this end. There we go. Hopefully that'll be less annoying for people. That was brilliant, the cat thing. It looked like you had a bit of a sort of wig going on. Okay, so axiology is, just repeat that again.
Yeah, so it's kind of like the formalized system of, or formalized study of axioms. And I was mentioning how Aristotle is kind of a realist. So he believes that the world exists as it does. So like when you look at a table, it's a table. There's no funny business going on.
There's no funny business going on, yep.
So, for example, like what's the essence of a table, or what's the essence of a chair? Well, the essence of a chair is in the form of the chair. It's the physical object in the form of a chair. That's the example. It is, because it exists as a chair, it is a chair. It's already given to you. It's giving to you by virtue of its existence what it is.
Sounds almost obvious.
Yes, it's kind of like.
It sounds almost like the axiologists are just kind of stating the bloody obvious. That's what it. Is that effectively what axiology is?
In a sense, because it's just saying the way that we come to know things is how they present themselves, and we can see that reason. Like we can use reason, we can use logical syllogisms to make arguments about those things, but the way that we perceive the world is the way the world is.
Right. Okay. Now that's interesting. Let me just throw a little bit of a curveball into this. The way that we perceive the world is the way that the world is. Let's take, for example, colour. So when I look at something that is red, it's not actually red, it's that the object has got a certain texture to it, and the light hitting it that has obviously what we call red frequencies in absorbs other frequencies and reflects the red frequency into my eyeball, which goes to the back and stimulates my red cones in my eye, and then that's then connected via nerves up to my brain, and my brain says I'm seeing something red, but in actual fact, what I'm just seeing is frequencies. Um, how does that fit with the idea that if you observe a certain thing, then that's how the world actually is? Because I'm not 100% sure the world actually is how we see. Because like your idea of red, for example, might be completely different to mine.
Yeah,
We
this gets
we
into
we agree it's red because we both label it as red. But if I was inside your brain looking at something red, I might go, "Hang on, that's not red, that's green."
yeah. Man, this is like a whole can of worms that we can, because on one hand we can say something like, oh well, red is in the mind. It
Yep.
actually doesn't even exist in the object. So the whole frequency thing, the texture of the object, all of that, that's nonsense. The color red, or the thing that we prescribe, the qualia of red, qualia is what it's like. Um, the color red is in my mind. It doesn't exist
Doesn't
physically.
exist. No.
It's all in my mind. That's a view. That's an empiricist view, actually, by a feller. Wow, what's his name? Bishop Berkeley. He's a Catholic bishop, um, and he wrote a book, Dialogues on Idealism. He was an idealist, but he was also an empiricist. And he's like, well, that's nonsense. Everyone knows that color is in the mind. Or when you feel pain, that's all in your mind. The pain doesn't exist externally. It's the sensation. It's what it feels like to have pain.
It's all in your brain. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then there's other people, or other camps, like someone like Daniel Dennett, who is also a empiricist, who would say, well, the phenomenon that we call red is just an illusion, but it's not in your mind. It's physical phenomena. But whatever consciousness is, the way that it perceives that physical phenomena is it emerges as red.
Yep.
So all of those complex patterns, all of those things interacting, the neurons firing in your brain, all of that constitutes the color red.
Yeah, it's not just the quality of the object itself, it's the whole experience.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay. So where would axiology fit in on that? Would axiology say that the item actually is red?
Well, axiology is more kind of like like I mentioned, the study of axioms. So it kind of depends what your worldview is, right? So it's a little bit lower.
So what do you mean by axioms? Axioms.
Axioms. So for example, if we have an axiom like the parallel postulate in Euclidean geometry, the parallel postulate says that if there's two lines that are in parallel to each other, they'll never intersect. That's an axiom, because from that axiom we can do all sorts of logical deductions and have a complete system of Euclidean geometry. So we just need a certain number of axioms. So they're self-evident truths. So for example, like the parallel postulate, there's a couple of others that I can't think of the top of my head, but from very basic truths, we can then deduct an entire system. And that's what we would call geometry for this example, right. Euclidean geometry.
Okay, I think I get that. So axiology is all about what it appears to be. Is that fair enough? Is that what you would say?
Based on the rules. So so that's why it's a little bit lower on the rung. So if we kind of stack it, it would be like metaphysics is like your biggest piece of the pie. And if we draw a circle within that, we would have epistemology, which is how we get to know things. Within that epistemology, we would have something like logic.
Yep.
And then within that circle of logic, we would have axiology, which would be the axioms that we base our logic from.
Right, I've got it. And is it fair to say that axiology kind of is closely related to empirical?
I guess that's where it depends on your flavor of ice cream, right? So if you're an empiricist, you might be more prone to have axioms which are based on an empiricist framework. you're a rationalist, you might have a more rational set of axioms. So your axioms are based on your flavor of ice cream.
I've got it. I think I've got it. That's quite a complex one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is why I kind of like to kind of split it. I don't like to maybe use the term axiology and kind of split. If we were to fuse axiology, it would be, if we were to break that apart, it would be, we have our ethics, we have our ontology, and we have our aesthetics.
All within that kind of branch of axiology. So let's just have a look at that a minute. So ethics, the whole idea of ethics, we're talking about coming at things from a moral perspective, principles, values, what you consider to be good and proper. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, it's just like your morals or your ethical systems.
I've got it. So axiology is all about what axioms you use to get to your conclusions. So a person might be their axiom might be ethics.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the main thing that they, because I seem to remember you saying that ethics is your big thing.
Yeah. Well, right now what I'm working on, where I'm stuck or where I'm kind of focusing on now is my ethics. I've kind of already gone through my metaphysics, my preferred epistemology, and then I've already set up kind of my axioms for my logic. So like, if I were to say, well, how do you even reason about these things? Well, I already have a principle for my logic, which would be, I favor the principle of non-contradiction over the principle of identity, something like that.
Okay.
So I've already have a foundation so that I can start making my ethics.
Right. And why do you think ethics is so important when you're kind of coming up with a new sort of outlook on things, a philosophy on things? Why ethics? Why is that important?
Yeah, because it's the practical aspect. It's so if you have, essentially, when you have your foundation, it's all theory. You can make assertions like the nature of reality is all mind. Everything's mind. Everything is just, atoms are just tiny little minds, and I'm just a mind, and then the universe is a mind.
Yep.
But then we, from there, even if we can rationally, logically have a proof, have an argument, have a complete system of how we can demonstrate that that's the case, how is it that one might live? That's the notion of ethics. So given that we are minds, how are we supposed to act? Because one could say, well, because we're just minds, it doesn't matter. We're just one big mind. So it could be preferable to, one, go with the flow and not give a crap about anything. Or we could say we should strive to have universal peace, universal love, because we're all one. So your ethics tells you how to live.
Right. Okay. And I can see how that idea of all being one, that would possibly come from your metaphysics. Okay. And you've kind of worked through those sort of phases, stages. You've worked through your epistemology to figure out how you're going to come to your conclusions. Then you've worked through your metaphysics, and you've come to a conclusion that we're all one and we need to love each other. And that's where you get your ethics.
Yep.
Ethics from.
Yeah, your ethics is kind of like your like if you're making your house out of Play-Doh or you're making your house out of Legos, how do you play that specific game, right? Because playing with Play-Doh and then playing with Legos.
I've got it. Yeah. So philosophy is all about, at the end of the day, you're trying to get to a conclusion on something, and these are all like kind of building blocks along the way, aren't they?
Yeah.
It's the way that you think. It's the methods that you think, that you use with your thinking, and then you're bringing in kind of things that will affect the way that you think. So, for example, your ethics. Your ethics is going to be concerned about other people. So the way that you think is going to take into consideration other people. Is that fair? Am I sort of understanding that correct? Or
yeah, that's pretty fair.
Okay.
Because, for example, you let me bring up this point because you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned how some of those that list that you made of the 250 different philosophies,
Yeah.
some of them were or tended to look like religions.
Yes,
So,
like Confucianism or Advaita Vedanta or Buddhism. Yep.
yeah, so is
Jainism.
it
I
the
think
case?
Jainism was another one.
Yeah, so is it the case that they're religions or are they philosophies, right? So like which one? How do we distinguish between the two? And the way that I would posit that question would be philosophy helps us or guides us question every aspect of those worldviews. So there may be religion kind of deals with worldviews, science kind of deals with worldviews. Philosophy shows us how we can kind of look at reality, however that may look like, so that we can have the flavor of reality, which is Christianity or secular humanism. And philosophy kind of gives us the tools to kind of analyze that critically.
Hello, cat.
Oh, there's a cat again. But ultimately, when we deal with something like religion, that worldview is distinct than philosophy. So Christianity might deal with philosophy itself, or might have philosophical notions or concepts, but it is not in itself a philosophy. It's a worldview.
Right. Whew. Okay, I think I'm getting that. We've lost Nick again. Is he still there?
Sorry about that.
That's all right. What's the cat called?
Her name's Akira.
Sakira. If I ever get a cat, I'm going to call it... If I ever get a new cat, I have actually got a cat, but if I ever get a new cat, I'm going to call it Schrodinger. Yeah. Right, so I think I'm getting this. So we're sort of building... So we start with our epistemology, our metaphysics. We've moved on to the logic of everything. We're looking at what axioms we're using in order to get to our points of view. So we're using ethics. The other one was aesthetics. To me, that conjures up what things look like.
Yeah. So it would be.
So how would aesthetics play in coming to a philosophical conclusion about something?
Yeah. So it's kind of the way that the world presents itself, in terms of like beauty. So beauty, or we usually think of beauty or things like that, or art, when we think of aesthetics. And aesthetics tells you a lot about the worldview. So it's the way, or it's like the primary way, or the presentation of a worldview. So, for example, Christianity has a certain distinct aesthetic, whether it's Eastern Orthodox, whether it's Catholicism, or even Protestantism. They all have a very distinct look, or art, or Baroque art, or Renaissance art. We can tell the difference between all of these types of artworks, and the way that they present themselves tells you about the values that those people have, or the values that, or certain aspects of the worldview,
the axioms from which they're working.
Yeah. So, for example, like Baroque art, one of the hidden, you could say, values, which would be it prefers the use of space, even to an absurd or a grotesque manner, because the absence or like negative space is seen as something that's bad. So it must overflow with representation or with beauty. It has to be exaggerated in that aspect, because the opposite of excess is ugly. That would be how an aesthetic presents itself. Tells you something about the worldview.
That's interesting. I'd have never thought about art, particularly art being used in religion, as being a form of philosophy. But you're right, because art is a language, isn't it? Art is a language. So there is a philosophy behind the way that art is presented, particularly with religion. I get that, because you've got like the iconography and all that kind of thing. Does that pervade into just everyday art? modern
Um,
artists and that sort of thing? Could you look at I mean, if you went to, say, the Modern Art Gallery in London, Tate Modern, and you were looking at a piece of art on the wall, would you be approaching that as a philosopher?
it would have yes, I would say yes, and it would
Mm.
have to, right? Because it tells you something about the way that the art the way that that artwork presents itself, even in the institution, like an art gallery, tells you something about the world that we live in. Because the world that we live in is
Oh
very hyper
yeah.
commercialized, hyper modernized. So we have pale walls, geometric modernism in most art galleries. There's price tags behind the artwork, so it seems that we view art as a commodity
There's
as opposed to.
secularism there as well. Yep, yep.
So in that aspect, yeah, the aesthetics, even of where the artwork is found, the institution of art tells you a lot about the world. Maybe not the worldview of the person that made the artwork, but just kind of like the cultural context in which that artwork was made.
Yeah, and it's not just the artist; it's the person that's viewing the art, isn't it? The
Hmm.
effect that has on the viewer.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so aesthetics is actually part of philosophy. Okay, and then the other one you mentioned there was ontology. Again, all part and parcel of these axioms on which you're building your worldview.
Hmm.
Ontology is about. You said earlier, I think you mentioned the word being.
Being.
Can you give me an example of that? Someone that uses ontology as an axiom to build their worldview.
Um, well, I guess depending on what axiom you use, right? So let's say one of your axioms is the principle of identity, which is if X has all of the properties of Y, then by definition, Y has to be the same thing as X. So if X is identical to Y isn't a new thing. It's just X. If it has every single attribute that X does, it would just
Is it
be
is
X.
it is it though? So, for example, like with mass production now, you can get identical objects. I mean, I've got two pens, yeah, and they
Mhm,
they are identical in every way. They're exactly the same pen,
mhm.
but they're not the same pen. You know?
Right. Um, well, that's when we're getting like something like a complex object, right? Like a pen.
Yeah.
But let's think about like fundamental objects, like something like an atom or like an electron. Um, there's something like the Pauli exclusion principle, which says two electrons cannot inhabit the same space because they're too similar, so they'll kind of repel each other. Um, well, that tells you something about an electron at the very least, which would be if an electron is so similar to another electron, two objects cannot inhabit the same space at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a contradiction in space. Um, so based on that principle, we can make all sorts of theoretical frameworks, including, um, that's the whole foundation of something like particle physics, which would be, um, there are these certain laws that if we tweak them in just the right way, we can get, you know, explosions that can create weapons of mass destruction. So depending on our axioms, depending on what we see as fundamental in our worldview, determines what we view as an object. So an object can be a complete mental abstraction, can be completely mental, can just be like, well, objects are just the way that my mind, because let's just assume that the whole world, the universe, everything that exists is just mind. Well, an object is just another mind. It's just a very simple type of mind.
Right. So yeah, and I suppose if you thought about a pen in your mind, and then a little bit later you thought about an identical pen, you could say that the two pens are identical because the thought process is identical. They are the same pen. They're the
Yeah.
same thought. Okay, yeah, I get that. Would this have any relation as well? Well, you're talking about atoms there. I was reading a while back about the idea of the single electron theory,
Hmm.
that there's not multiple electrons in the universe. There's just one, and it moves around really quick.
Yeah.
Would that come into this idea of, I suppose, ontology? This idea of being. That would be an example of philosophy going down the
Yeah.
ontological route.
Yeah, because based on a certain assumption of physics, it necessitates that something like one atom, which moves really fast, or is the only atom, or sorry, the only electron particle that exists, by virtue of a certain interpretation of the laws of physics, it has to be the case that there's only one electron. So it tells you something about the nature of being, it tells you something about how reality is.
That's amazing. Okay, yeah, yeah, I get that. I get that. I really get that. So the axiology, the philosophy of axiology, you're coming from like the ethics, which is kind of a more sort of touchy feely thing. It's all about moral principles, values, how people interact with each other and treat each other, that kind of thing. You've then got your aesthetics, which is all about what it looks like. What does that tell us about the world? And then you've got the ontological, which is getting down to the very nature of what things actually are.
Yeah,
And
pretty fair.
that's your whole sort of axiology kind of philosophy. And the aim of this at the end of the day, whether you're coming at it from the ethical point of view or what things look like or the nature of being, what is it you're actually trying to achieve with axiology?
It would just be to kind of carve out your metaphysics, right? So if we have certain assumptions about how the world looks, how the world,
Mm-hmm.
how one lives in the world, how one might act in the said world, or ethics, and then our ontology, so how things are in reality.
In
We have
reality, yeah.
that axiology kind of bundled up. We have something concrete there that tells us, like, well, seems to me that based on those three things, whatever they are, they can only be compatible if you have a certain view of metaphysics. Let's say you believe that there's only minds, or you believe that there's only physical things. Well, if you believe one of the other, so if you only believe that there are minds, that kind of narrows down what you can believe in terms of your axiology, your ethics, or your ontology.
Because you'd start getting contradictions.
Yeah,
You
like
you
for
couldn't you
example,
couldn't yeah.
you really can't be a, well, you can, but just for sake of the argument, you really can't say, well, my metaphysics is that there's only mental stuff, and then be like, but there's this physical chair, there's this concrete chair that actually exists outside of my mind that's
Yeah,
physical.
so you couldn't say, for example, oh, I'm a metaphysical philosopher insofar as I believe that everything is mind and there's nothing physical, but then say I also adhere to ontology insofar as there is a single electron that moves around, because you're then starting to get into the physical. You've just
Yeah,
moved from after physics back into physics again, so you'd be contradicting yourself.
yeah, or even the most traditional, like there's a this has have been debated since, the probably the inception of human thought, which would be this distinction between epistemology and ontology. So just because the way we know something, or the way that we acquire that knowledge, tells us something about the world, we can't then make that leap from epistemology to ontology. So saying just because we know this about the world doesn't mean that the world actually is this way. That's a
Right.
big leap.
Yes, your senses could be misleading you.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. So in that case, so you've got your epistemology. You think you know what things look like because you're coming from, let's say, an empirical point of view. I can see it looks like this, so I tend to think the world works like that. And I've got this rationalist sort of idea that sort of makes sense to me. That is how the world is. Yeah. But then to jump to the ontological philosophy, which is the world actually is like this. This is the nature of being. Why? Well, yeah, because your senses could be misleading you. So how would you get around that? How would you say, like, this is what I think the world is? How would you actually get to the ontological stage where you say, we actually have evidence that the world actually is this way? Or can you never get there?
There's it depends on what we mean, and it depends on for example, what our value is in something like absolute certainty. So that's like the age-old problem. That's the number one thing my professors would tell me, which is you actually can't have absolute certainty about anything. So with that principle in mind, we can only get close approximations.
Yeah.
So let me give you something like Spinoza's God, which is it's based on the axiom that of the ontological proof of God, which is if there is a perfect being, if that being exists, or because it is perfect, one of its properties has to be that it exists. Because something that exists, or sorry, something that is perfect but didn't exist would be a contradiction, right? Perfection, if it entails perfection, then it entails that it exists. Something like that.
Something like that. Okay, yeah, I think I get that.
So because there is something which exists,
yeah, you're sure that there's something. You may not be entirely sure what the nature of it is, but you know that there is something because you're experiencing it, even if that something is an illusion.
Yeah. Because of that, because we know something exists, we can work our way back all the way to the first principle. So we can be like, oh, well, we observe this chair. Chairs behave in this way. They make certain impressions in my mind. These impressions are logical in nature. Because my mind has these logical structures, we can then make assertions about the ultimate nature of reality, whatever that is. And if that ultimate nature is reasonable, or it is grounded in reason, then by virtue of things existing, like a chair, this thing that is more simple than a chair, it's the ultimate foundation of all of experience, that has to exist because this chair exists. So you worked your way back. You did,
and they do tend to be assertions for the most part. They could be. I suppose that's the whole idea of philosophy, isn't it? That you can never have absolute certainty.
Yeah, philosophy is not dogmatic about that in that sense. That's why we have something like religion, which tells you these are the dogmas.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, that moves into we're absolutely certain and everybody else is wrong. I'm just going to give you a quick shout out to a guy called Ryan, if he's listening still. He's tuned in on the chat. He says he's watching us. It's 3:30 in the morning where he is at the moment, so he's up there. So Ryan just said if x equals x, or x equals y, or y equals x, there has to be something in the beginning. Nothing can not equal x. Do you even understand what that means?
Yeah.
If x equals x, or x equals y, or y equals x, there has to be something in the beginning. Nothing can not equal x.
Yeah, so there has to be something. So that gets us to the question of, is there something? Why is there something rather than nothing? But couldn't we just simply move the question to, if x has all of these properties and all of those properties are zero or said or nothing, then nothing equals nothing. That's tautological. So nothing is nothing. It's the same. And by same virtue, if we say something like x has all of these attributes are infinite, we can't describe them, we just know that they're infinite, x, and then we have this other thing that's x, and it has the same exact number of attributes, same number of properties, it's identical to this other object or this thing, and we know that by virtue of reason, well, then we have to say something like, well, x, by the principle of the property of identity, has to be x. They're the same thing. They're identical.
Has to be x. Right. I don't know whether Ryan is coming from this angle. So I know for a fact that Ryan is actually a Christian. So he used to be a Jehovah's Witness, and he left, and he's now like I don't know what kind of. He's not like Church of England or anything like that. I think more sort of born again Christian, that kind of thing. So he obviously believes in God and he believes in Jesus, and I assume he believes that the two are the same. He says you could never reply on your own mind or conscience if you think that everything has just happened by accident. Otherwise, how could you trust your own mind? How could you ever rely on the conclusions you've come to? We have to get to X first. And in maths, nothing can not equal X. Oh, and he's an evangelical Christian. I wonder whether this kind of philosophical line of reasoning with the X equals Y and everything, whether that would that have any bearing on a person that goes down the Trinitarian route?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the tradition, right? To just answer or just touch on a couple of his points, it sounds like he's bringing up a presuppositional argument, which is we need something, whatever that is, let's call it God. We need that thing to instantiate everything else because that's the foundation for everything. For example, logic, the nature of reality, ethics, everything. So God is the foundation for all of those things. So we have something, whatever that is, let's say it's pure being, and from pure being, we can now make the leap to X, right? Because something exists, that thing, which is uncaused or uncreated, is God, well, then we have a proof for God. Because it's like, oh, well, clearly there has to be something prior to, something has to be uncreated for something to come into existence. That's creation ex nihilo. And so that's kind of where he's coming from, I suppose.
He says not just God, but in everything there needs to be something to equal something else.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the notion of the Trinity, isn't it? Which would be that God differentiates himself through the three persons of the Trinity, which would be God, which is uncreated, unmoved, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and what's the other one?
Omnipresent?
Yeah,
omnipotent?
So whatever, all the omnis, you know what I'm getting
all the
at.
omnis, yeah.
Because God has all of those properties, the only way that we can instantiate something like relational love in the Trinity would be through the three persons. So the Father loves the Son, and through that communion, they are able to then share their love through the Holy Spirit. Because there's difference introduced into that relationship, we have something like God is love.
Yeah, me and Chris have had a conversation a bit like this before, in that creation comes through separation. You know, you're starting with something, even if it's an eternal everything, like an eternal potentiality. If you want to call it God, call it source, call it whatever, but you've effectively got to start off with something that is eternal in order to get to the various different sort of fractions of everything that we know about us. So Ryan is saying not just in religion, not just in the idea of God, but also even in things like maths and science, you've got to have something to start with in order to build your framework on. That's interesting, because that actually, to me, that would imply that there are intrinsic mathematical and scientific things that exist in their own right, even before we discover them. So, you know, like 1 and 1 is 2, the principle of that, it already exists. So when it comes to philosophy, we're just really discovering things rather than creating things.
Yeah, that gets us into like the metaphysical position of like Platonism. That's what that is.
Is it? Was it Plato that did the solids?
Well, it has the Platonic solids, but it ties in with like the world of forms.
World of forms, right? Yeah.
So if we have like 1 to the numerical sequence, natural numbers, if we have something like that in maths, there's no proof for the number of 1. 1 is just like a principle. It's a bare principle. It's just 1 is 1. It's a tautological. It's self-referential in a way. It self-predicates. And you know, if we can go further back, we can, you know, if we're using set theory, then we can actually then say something like, well, 1 is the set of 1, you know, or 1, or like 2 is the set of 0 and 1. So the set of 2 contains both 0 and 1, and the set of 3 contains 1 and 2, and so forth. You can create all of the numbers through set theory. Um, well, the axiom by which we assert that, which would be like, we can have like this the set of all sets or something like that. The axiom that we pick has to be something that we can't prove. That's part of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which tells us that we can have something like coherence, but then it would be incomplete. We can have something like a complete system, but then it would either be incoherent. What's the third one? It's coherent, incomplete. I forget what the third one is. But we can have all of those instances. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem tells us we can have true statements. We just don't have proofs for them. They're just true in and of themselves. And we can try to prove those things, but then we would have to use something like a meta logic or something outside of that system to prove that axiom.
Yeah, and so I suppose when you start getting into the realms of God, that starts getting that way, doesn't it? Probably the greatest proof of God is probably going to be your own rationalism, isn't it? Your own intuitions, your own experiences, even empiricalism, but it would be a personal empiricalism. You might not necessarily be able to get somebody else to concur with your experience.
Yeah, like reason and experience only get you so far. I mean, I think that's why part of it is that leap of faith, that the
leap of faith into the spiritual and religious side of things. So Ryan was talking about beginnings as well. So the way I understand it is there has to be some eternal potentiality, something that doesn't have a beginning, that is outside of time and space to begin with, and that would include all potentiality, all knowledge, all reality, all thought, every conceivable option that can be, but there has to be a beginning to this physical world that we're understanding. There has to be some start to it.
I would just find that contentious. I would want to push back on that. I see where he's coming from, and it would make sense coming from the Christian paradigm, from the Christian worldview. I would just say that there's ways that you can argue against that, or you can have a worldview that how would I say this? You can have a worldview that says, yeah, like we can actually have radical contingency, like nothing has to be necessary for everything to exist. Because what he's saying is that there's ultimately some necessary being, whatever it is, something is necessary for things to exist.
That's and I guess I'm saying the same thing, although I'm not like evangelical Christian. I do sort of have a belief that there is an underlying source, or Brahman manifest, if you want to go down the Hindu route, that is eternal, full of every potentiality, and that is from which this universe has had a beginning. Well, not necessarily this universe. I do tend to believe in multiple iterations of a universe. So like there's a universe that starts and finishes, and then starts and finishes, and starts and finishes, and that kind of blip in the middle where the universe ends and then starts again is kind of a return back to that source of all potentiality. But that there is some underlying foundation upon which reality is actually built. That's kind of my... And well, somebody like Ryan would label that God. He's just Ryan's just said he's not a Jehovah's Witness anymore, so he can cope with debate. I love it.
I was going to say, with that cyclical picture of the universe, the whole expansion collapse and its repetition ad infinitum. So it's just infinite. Well, that whole pattern of repetition would be an attribute of God, whatever God is. Ultimate potentiality or whatever.
Yeah, because I would call that the outbreathing of God and the inbreathing of God. You know, if you're going to use the word God, it's that kind of existence, isn't it? This brings in sort of my background with Pandeism, Advaita Vedanta. This is quite good as well, because like we've got a philosopher on the scene, we've got an evangelical Christian, and we've got someone who's sort of somewhere in the Hindu route, and we're we're all friends. That's really good. So that's the axiom. I think we've done that one to death. Axiology. Political. Did we say we? No, we've put political in with the axiology, haven't we? So just branching out from there, we've then got like 250 something various philosophies that are built on those few branches. Yeah. How many of those are you familiar with? I don't know if you sort of saw the.
I did. I went through the whole.
You saw the list. You went through the list, yeah.
I'm familiar with. Okay, it depends on what you mean between, or what constitutes being familiar or acquainted, and then being like an expert or something. Like I'm not an expert in any number of those, but I'm acquainted with a portion of them. One of them that I thought was interesting that I saw on your list was because it's like A through Z, or A through Z.
A through Z list, yeah.
Yeah. Xenofeminism was.
Yeah, xenofeminism. What's that one? What's that all about?
Xenofeminism is kind of like it's an emancipatory. You could maybe say feminism or like or politics, which is kind of saying like, it's not just liberation of the sexes; it's liberation of something like the not even, it's beyond the binary spectrum, and it's beyond spectrum as a whole. It's kind of like we to use like a Blade Runner reference, it's kind of like body modification or experimentation, or even like the xenomorph from what is it, Alien. Xenofeminism is kind of saying something like how can we not just transcend the gender binary, how can we transcend biological restrictions? So something like artificial wombs, or the liberation from something like the the female sex is the only one that's capable at the time of reproduction, and so there's a labor of birth, of becoming pregnant, that can still be a nexus for emancipation. Like women can, the female sex can still be liberated from that biological restraint of being the only one that can get pregnant, something like that.
Yeah. What's xenophobic? What does that word mean? Xenophobic.
Just being like, well, in terms of the context that it's used on, most of the time it's just someone that's adverse to races. So something that's against someone that's against difference, and prefers like ethnocentric or homocentric views of their like nation state. So like that term gets thrown a lot in for like people abroad, like Japanese people who are seen as xenophobic. They don't really like foreigners.
Okay, right. So, and then you've got xenofeminism.
Mm-hmm.
So how's that translate across?
So
what's the xeno bit mean?
The xeno is like that extra, like that beyond aspect. So
okay.
How would I say this? It's because it gets into like really weird things. So it's not, we're no longer talking about feminism in terms of like fourth wave feminism or something like that. My cat's about to jump. We're going as far as like body modification, like the liberation of the human flesh, for example.
All right.
So there's a theory about how capitalism. One second, I'm gonna turn off my camera.
Oh, that's quick. All right. Don't worry about the cat. It's fine.
We have a notion about how capitalism is making things more effeminate. That's an argument that's been posited. So we see things like testosterone lowering as a civilization gets more and more modernized. And so with that, we no longer have a clear biological binary between male and female. it's something more like, for something to be female or to be feminized is more like a becoming feminine.
Right.
So an entire civilization can become feminine. The emergence of artificial intelligence could be feminine. So it's kind of the, in a lot of ways we see like Siri or Alexa, they're why are they seen as feminine avatars?
Yeah, and then you end up with the was it in Wonder Woman we were watching the other evening with the whole the Amazonians where it's all women. There's no guys anymore. They don't even need guys because the babies are produced by molded out of clay.
Yeah,
and breathe life into them via Zeus. So the guys aren't needed anymore.
So it's kind of bringing that feminist aspect, that emancipatory politics to not just human or to the organic substrate. We can then extend it to something like artificial intelligence or the cybernetic substrate, silicone.
That's interesting. Okay.
Or aliens.
Or aliens, yeah. So there was like 250 of those on that list the other evening. I don't know if you've seen them, but I've started making these mugs. Can you see that one? I'm awake. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool, isn't it? I've started doing a whole range of mugs, and one of them is a philosophy mug, and I've not finished it yet, but I'm putting all of those philosophies on a mug. So you can, like, while you're drinking your tea, you can look through them. Right, so I think I've got that. A quick recap then. So epistemology is the study of the exploration itself. Is how we get to our conclusions, the language that we use, the methods that we use. So that might be empiricalism, so that using our senses. It might be rationalism, the intuitive sort of nature of just knowing, I think therefore I am, a priori. We've got the metaphysics, which is kind of beyond physics. It's after physics. So this tends to be the sort of things to do with time, space, consciousness, these sort of things that may not necessarily be able to be tested through science. We've then got our axioms or our axiology, various different ways of coming to our conclusions. So that might be our ethics, moral principles, that sort of things. It might be to do what things look like, aesthetics. It might be ontology, which is looking at the actual being, the actual existence of things and drawing conclusions from that. You put all that together, that's kind of your foundation on which you're building your philosophy. And then we've got all these other branches that branch out from, but they're the key underpinning sort of ideas, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Is that I've got it. I understand philosophy at last. So just going beyond that then, just to sort of tie this up, have you got any favourite philosophers or philosophies? Are there any that you go, oh, they're my favourite, they are? Someone you'd have their face on a mug.
Yeah. I'm really... Okay, so I guess it has to do with like what I'm indebted to. So I guess like the traditions that I was, maybe not the ones that I belong to now, but maybe like the ones that I was brought up in, going to school and my professors, things like that. I'm really indebted to the ancients, the Greeks, Plato,
yeah.
Aristotle, Socrates. I think any philosophy program worth its salt, if it doesn't teach you the classics, then, or at least in the Western context, because I mean, there's a divide in philosophy, in contemporary philosophy, between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. And in short, analytic philosophy is just the analytic, more scientific leaning philosophy, which tends to be specialized. It tends to focus in on its questions and what it's trying to answer. So, for example, there's a philosophy of language, there's a philosophy of science, there's a philosophy of mathematics. And within those fields, we ask very specific questions. So, what is the nature, or what are the philosophical implications of the twin prime conjecture, something like that. So it asks very specific questions about that particular field. And then there's continental philosophy, which is more it's continental because of the continent of Europe. That's literally where that name comes from. But it's continental in the sense that it asks questions about like humanity at large, like geopolitics, or even the nature of existence. So we have prime examples like Nietzsche is a very famous continental philosopher of sorts. Hegel. Who else would I be thinking of here?
Where would Spinoza fit into all of that?
He would be technically a continental philosopher. He is a pre-Enlightenment thinker. So just after the Renaissance, but before the 17th century Enlightenment.
Yeah, because I quite like. I've not done a lot of study on Spinoza, but what I have read so far, because there's the expression about Spinoza's God. He seems to be a bit of a pandeist, or at least a pantheist.
Yeah, it's kind of contended what he is. So a lot of people say he's a panpsychist and panentheist or pandeist.
Yeah, he sort of says a little bit about everything on, the idea that God is the universe, that sort of thing. Yeah. So your favourites then? You're sort of old school. You like the Socrates and the Platos and the Aristotles.
Yeah, at least that's what the context of like my academic upbringing, and then from there I'm indebted to medieval and scholastic philosophy. So like Thomas Aquinas, Duns Scotus. I'm not as well versed in those guys as I am in ancient philosophy, but if we were talking about more contemporary figures, or at least people that I see a kindled flame with, so to speak, it would be people like Spinoza, Gilles Deleuze, who's a French philosopher. I probably have the largest indebted intellectual debt to Gilles Deleuze. And then currently would be another French philosopher, Quentin Meillassoux.
Right. I just wanted to finish up the podcast on that, actually. So one of the questions I was going to ask is, what are you working on at the moment? There's there was something on your post, on your Twitters. Let me just see if I can... You said you're dropping a short intro in the form of a thread on a project you're working on regarding an internal overturning of Plato through the works of Jaimes Deleuze, and relation it has with Christianity as a nexus for a material ethics or ontology of agape. Is that what you're working on at the moment? Yeah.
So that's kind of that whole, like a holistic...
Yeah, can you just unravel that a little bit, because that's kind of for my little brain. So we're saying you're working on a philosophy at the moment. You're trying to overturn Plato, even though you love Plato. You're trying to overturn Plato using this other guy, Deleuze, that you
Gilles Deleuze,
that you're
one of the guys
indebted to. And what you're doing is you're trying to come up with a philosophy that involves Christianity and agape, which is love, and tying that into material ethics.
Yes.
Okay. So what are you actually trying to achieve with that, in a nutshell?
So I'm trying to create instead of a transcendent Christianity, I'm trying to create an immanent Christianity.
Ooh,
so
how
do we arrive at a Christian ethics of love, of universal love, when we don't have something like a transcendent God? So if we say something like reality exists and there's no such thing as a necessary God, there's no such thing as a God of the Bible, there's no such thing as the philosopher's God, and there's no necessary being, so we can't invoke something.
So if you get rid of all of that, can you effectively still live your life like a Christian?
Yes.
Right, okay, that's interesting.
So, so we only have something like,
Just Ryan, Ryan's. I think he's starting a flag. Actually, he says you might have to go to sleep soon because he's got to be up at 8 in Birmingham. Can he thank Nick? He's really enjoyed listening and the interaction. It's always good to hear other points of view. He says it's Z, not Z. Whatever that means. He loves the mugs, and he says, would we be able to have morals without the Bible? I guess that's what your project is all about, is it?
yeah, in a way, yes, because if I'm trying to invoke Christianity, then I can't use its normal or its traditional tools to argue for it. So if I'm not using something like the Bible, how is it that we arrive at the virtues or the values of Christianity? And it would have to come from outside of the Bible. Traditionally, we think that God reveals those things to us. So through revelation, through Scripture, through the Holy Spirit, something like the Bible or the commandments are given to us, and that's how we have objective morality. And I would just say that through the principle of agape, we can actually work our way backwards and then form Christianity. So through the principle of universal love, we can have God.
So even if God didn't exist, even if Christianity didn't exist, if Jesus didn't exist, if the whole religious aspect of Christianity had never been thought of, if we start from the end point, which is love, we could arrive at a conclusion that there is a God, that there is a Jesus.
Yes, or maybe not Jesus, but
a source of love.
Let me put it this way. If we have something like the notion of universal love, and this, I'm going to start just quoting an argument by Quentin Meillassoux, because that's just where I'm kind of getting that.
That's where you're getting it from.
Which is, we can't, as an atheist, for example, we can't have values, or if we do have values, we have to appeal to something like the forms. So how do we have objective morality? Well, there are these objective things that exist outside of human perception. They're real because they're these transcendental objects. We know them through our intuition or through our reason, and they have to be the case, or else we don't have objective morality. Other than that, you can say something like, oh, well, human convention or human norms give us ethics. The best that you can have through an atheist worldview is an ethical system, which would be governed by either reason, so treat one another as you would want to be treated, something like the golden rule, or something like the universal Kantian maxims, which would be why is lying good, or sorry, why is lying bad? Because if everyone lied, then there would be no such thing as the notion of truth. That's unreasonable. That gets us into contradiction, which means there is a concept of truth, and that's why people shouldn't lie.
So it all comes down to optimal living, doesn't it?
Yes, through like what is the most reasonable? Reason governs our ethics. That would be the Kantian framework.
So I've often wondered, let's say, for example, there is a God. Let's just assume there is a God and there is a Jesus and there is a particular way of worshipping and living your life that they want you to do, but you don't believe in them. You don't believe in God. You don't believe in Jesus. But somehow you're able to get from an atheistic point of view, through these philosophies, back to a point where you are practically living your life exactly the same way that a God or a Jesus would have you live. It always strikes me that God, that Jesus, would be happy with that. Probably more happy with that than someone who professes to be a Christian, but then isn't living the way that Christ would have them live. In other words, do we need to believe in Jesus or God in order to fulfill what Jesus or God wants you to do, if they exist?
Yeah, I would say yes, in the Western context. I think that's why I would see myself as a Christian, to some degree or some capacity.
So even though you're an atheist, you do see yourself as a Christian.
Yeah, at least to like a
Wow.
cultural Christian.
Cultural
Of
Christian.
sort. And I wouldn't say that in the conservative way, because I'm not a conservative. I don't think that, for example, something like I don't believe that abortion is something that's like of moral consequence. I'm traditionally, or at least colloquially, liberal. Just I wouldn't see myself as a conservative. And I know when people say they see themselves as a cultural Christian, they tend to be of a more conservative flavor.
So cultural Christian, by that you would be that. I guess that sort of you believe there was a Jesus. You believe that Jesus taught things of ethical value, and you follow those ethics, but you don't necessarily believe, for example, in the miracles and the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Not at the face value of analysis, no. So maybe I don't. Maybe I'll put it this way. Maybe I don't hold things like like the homosexuality is abhorrent or something. That's a moral qualm. But that doesn't mean that I don't hold value to something like the resurrection, or even be agnostic to the notion of a resurrection. And the reason why I say that is because it's actually useful to have something like that for the argument, for something like the argument that Quentin Mayesu brings up.
That's really interesting, that, Nick. So when you say you were atheist, I would have just thought, yeah, he's an atheist. He doesn't. Could you ever see yourself through the process of philosophy? Would you ever rule out the fact that you could find yourself back at a point where you were a Christian again, maybe like Ryan? Is that possible? Could you through the process of philosophy suddenly find that you're born again?
I think I'm already in a way at that point.
Really?
Because I think that the philosophy that I'm trying to work out, which if it's trying to, if in a way we live in a world where atheism seems to be rapidly growing. So given that atheism is the cultural context that we find ourselves in, or in more and more seems to be like the primary cultural context or the cultural belief we find ourselves in, how is it that how can I update the metaphysics for Christianity in an atheist world? So I'm trying to make Christianity perhaps maybe not palatable, but coherent within an atheistic worldview.
Yeah.
So I don't care if an atheist agrees with the conclusions of my argument. I'm trying to show, maybe, given that atheism is true, let's just start with that starting point. Let's say atheism is true. Let's say there is no God. How can I still get Christianity? How can I still get a God?
Through a process of philosophical reasoning. If your philosophical reasoning led you to that point, would you then change your view that there is a God?
I guess where I'm at, it's maybe not so much that there is a God as much as, and this is Quentin Mayesu's argument, which is there could be a God.
There could be a God, yeah. So because at the moment, it sounds like you're a bit more agnostic than atheist.
In a sense, I would say right now, currently, like how we exist, like how we're talking right now, there is no God. God doesn't exist. He's not.
But you don't have any proof of a God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as God, and I would even go as far as to say there's no necessary being that we could call God. There's nothing which is the nexus of all of existence, like the principle of unity or oneness or anything that we could be like, okay, well, that's kind of like God. I would even go as far as to say that doesn't exist.
So even sort of my views on source and that sort of thing at this stage, you've not got any sort of philosophical reason as to believe in those things. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Ryan, who said he was going to bed and he still hasn't, he says it's interesting how Nick can still believe in the resurrection of Jesus, which he believes is the main pillar of Christianity. And then he just, this is, I think this is great. He says, why can't we all think like this? I think he's talking about the process that we're going through this evening of just thinking, using our brains, you know? Why can't everybody go through this process? Because it strikes me that in your philosophical approach, it strikes me that you're very honest. You're asking the questions and you're basically using your brain, which a lot of people don't do they?
Yeah, one of the things that I told myself, even like when I was leaving the
critical thinking,
was I would follow the truth, and I think that's an aspect of my JW past life that I still hold on to. Whatever the truth is, wherever that takes me, if it's atheism, radical atheism, or if it's radical theism, wherever that truth took me, I would go there.
Yeah.
So I think that's the one principle. I don't care. I don't care what I personally believe. It may not be palatable to my personal beliefs or my personal views. If that's not what truth is, then I don't really care for it.
I love that. I think that sums everything up. Coming back to the beginning, what is philosophy? It's a set of ideas about knowledge, truth, and the nature and meaning of life. That's the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition. So you're after truth. I love it. Yeah. And that's kind of what I'm after as well. And I think Ryan's after that as well. He says, follow the truth wherever it goes, critical thinking, and then he says respect. So that's been an absolutely amazing discussion. I think we need to wrap that up now because we're coming up to 2 hours. Can you believe it? Any final little thoughts that you'd like to leave just for the ex-JW who's never been exposed to critical thinking when it comes to philosophy?
I guess, yeah, just to add to that, I think a lot of times we see critical thinking, especially growing up in a religious context, we see critical thinking as something sinful or as something that is closely associated with Satan. You know, Satan was deceitful, was thinking, was using reason and making Eve use her thinking, her thinking faculties to sin. I would just say this: if God created you in his image or in its image, and that includes reason, then that is the way that we can approach God. It is the one thing that humans have that's not physical. It's not our eyes, it's not our nose, it's not our senses. The way that we reason about things, it's the one way we can approach God, which if God is not physical, it's the one thing that we know we have because we all think, and it's the thing that's most closely like God.
That's amazing. Yeah. So if you want to find the truth, and if there is a God and you want to really find God, use your brain. Use your brain. And do you think you can reach that point using just your critical thinking abilities, or do you think you need a religion behind you telling you what to think? Do you think you can do it on your own if you develop the critical thinking skills? I mean,
I think thinking and reasoning and critical thinking gets you half of the way, and this is where that's why I kind of bootstrap a lot of my philosophy to religion, because you can use this critical thinking, you can use reasoning, and it only gets you so far. It gets you to the edge of the abyss, so to speak. But at the edge of the abyss, you either have to, I think it's Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher, who said it's either you make the leap of faith or you stay at that edge forever, and you just stay there and you just contemplate. That's the aesthetic or the ethical life, where you don't make the leap because it's not your reasoning, your appetite for reasoning that isn't satisfied. You keep coming to the same puzzles, the same paradoxes. You just keep thinking, man, I can't solve this problem. This doesn't make sense, or God doesn't work this way.
Immobilized,
why doesn't it work? Why doesn't it add up? Why is reality not adding up to the way that I think it should? Once you can overcome that, you can then, in a very clear and sensical way, that is a time when you can make that leap of faith. That's when your soul tastes God.
I love it. We're going to leave it on that, because that is absolutely awesome. So, and Ryan agrees. He says, bang on, Nick, trust your instinct. Love it. So what was that? Rationalism. So thank you, Nick. If you can just hang around for a little bit, I shall just wind up this show and then just come back to you. But that's been really good. Thank you so much. All right.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So that, everybody, was Nick Jaimes talking about philosophy, and I entered that conversation knowing practically nothing about the terminology and the words and everything that Nick uses when he's talking about his philosophy. And I've come out of that having learnt so much. I've got loads of words now that I can throw around that make me sound like I know what I'm talking about. But that's been absolutely brilliant. So we'd like to thank Nick, thank everybody for who's on the live stream listening in there. Thank you especially to Ryan. He says, go out and read as many different books as possible, both for and against. Listen to debates, expand your mind. And he says he's off to bed again. So thanks, everybody, for joining in. That's all from me and Nick this time. Stay curious.